Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the ID5 podcast. Today we're going to take a sidestep slightly and talk a lot more than usual about the mobile world, because I'm very happy to welcome Eric Seufert on the podcast. Eric is an independent analyst and the owner of mobile dev Memo. Eric, welcome to the ID5 podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So let's get straight into it. You know, the topic of the podcast is sustainability. I know you've been kind of speaking about digital advertising, and you have a very keen eye on kind of what changes are happening in this industry. Do you think, and digital advertising has a really important role in kind of supporting the open web, supporting access to content and services. Do you think the industry is growing sustainably? Do you think we can consider, you know, that advertising will be the business model for the open web in the next 10 to 15 years? Or what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, I think it's growing sustainably. I think you obviously had a bump from COVID, which was probably pronounced relative to growth rates prior to that, but in some ways it could have changed the baseline, right? You know, if you read Ben Thompson, he writes a blog called Predatory.
Yeah.
He's talked a lot about how COVID just kind of pulled forward a lot of behaviors that would have been norms like in 5 years, right? It just sort of like fast forwarded us through to a point where we use our phones a lot more, and they just play a even bigger role than in our daily lives than they had. And so if you kind of take that view, then this was just a step change. What we saw in terms of engagement and time spent on the device during COVID was just a step change, and it won't revert back to like a previous mean. It'll just stay there because it was just a very quick sort of like adaptation cycle or an acceleration through the adaptation cycle. So, you know, in that sense, yeah, it's certainly sustainable, and it will be sustained and probably will continue growing. And you know, if you take that view, then there's all sorts of exciting things that happen as a result of that, because you've got behaviors that have changed, and the products and the sort of product ecosystems need to catch up with those behaviors. And so there's a whole lot of room, a whole lot of headroom to sort of generate value in sort of filling that time and sort of facilitating that engagement.
Yeah, it's clearly accelerated usage, and so that's a sustainable base to work from. But when we talk about digital advertising in particular as the fuel that powers kind of, you know, content and services and access to content and services on digital devices, there are certainly a lot of headwinds, right? I mean, you've talked about IDFA changes and the impact it's had on Facebook a lot as well. You've talked about what was the exact term, privacy mirage, right? All of those kind of headwinds in a way, as to, you know, that relates to the business model that's been supporting kind of internet and online kind of content and services. How do you see that playing out in the future?
Well, the big question is, you know, because digital advertising thrived in this environment, you know, that you call the open web, you know, also the open mobile. And the question that, you know, the question that needs to be sort of grappled with is, does the open web continue to exist, and does open mobile continue to exist? And if not, then probably no. There is no sort of like sustainable, you know, sort of digital advertising growth, because it's going to be massively constrained, right, by you know these sort of
the closed ecosystem, basically.
Yeah, and the barriers that the closed ecosystem creates to sort of moving users around and into different products, and to just generally exposing people to stuff through ads. And it'd be a shame if that happens, I think. You know, and that's, you know, that's the kind of lens that you have to consider these changes from. Like, are they being done? Are they being instigated? You know, on behalf of the user and on behalf of sort of privacy, or are they being instigated on behalf of the platform owners, you know, sort of in service to sort of like competitive suppression, right? My take on some of these things is, you know, it's a mix, right? And a lot of them, I think a lot of these projects are sort of, you know, they kind of are introduced under the banner of like, you know, protecting the consumer's privacy and you know, you know, protecting the sort of like comfort of their experience, but really they're just designed as like land grabs, in, you know, sort of like seeing that, well, these big platforms are probably going to be disrupted, and the way to not have them be disrupted and the way to protect them is to build big walls around them. And the easiest way to do that and have the sort of consumer abide by it is to tell them that, you know, it's out of you know,
it's for your own good.
Out of a sense of duty for, you know, for their, you know, for the benefit of their privacy.
Mm. We've seen a lot of those kind of comments, right? I think there's another term that I like, which is predatory privacy, which is really using privacy as a means to strengthens one kind of position, competitive position. What would you think is kind of some of the most obvious initiatives that have gone into that direction?
Well, I mean, you know, it's hard to say, you know, to point to one and say, well, this is clearly just a, you know, predatory maneuver. I mean, I think, you know, my opinion is probably clear from like what I've written on Mobile Memo. You know, I don't want to necessarily rehash that and point fingers, but I think like in general, it's hard. My sort of general thesis here is like, anytime a company starts talking about privacy, they're trying to sell you something, or they're trying to protect some sort of like commercial interest of theirs, right? Because I think, first of all, companies it's, you know, you talk about like, oh, well, Apple cares about privacy, or you know, some company cares about privacy. Well, how could a corporation care about privacy, right? How they don't have the agency to care about something like that. Privacy is an abstract concept, right? You know, corporations care about shareholder value, and that's it. And that has to be true. And so just that's definitionally true. And so it'd be like, I don't know, it'd be like a company saying that they care about love, or, you know, they care about freedom. Like, those are just abstract concepts. Like, how could they possibly care about that? They care about their commercial interests, and they care about, you know, the sort of growth trajectory of their company. And so your privacy is just used as a Trojan horse, I think, in a lot of ways. And it's a really effective one, because, you know, it's hard to, especially on digital products, it's hard to know what that even means. What does it mean to protect your privacy, right? Like, well, I don't want my credit card number floating around in the ether, but I'm pretty sure that's probably not happening, or that's not what any of these privacy protective measures are trying to prevent, right? I don't want people, if there was a webcam put in my shower, that would be a sort of like egregious violation of my privacy, but I don't think that's happening, right? What's happening is like this, you know, my sort of records of my clicks are being sort of aggregated around a sort of abstract identifier for me, but that doesn't like necessarily get used in a way that's personally identifiable, right? Like, if you think about like, you know, like a targeting algorithm on an ad platform, okay, you've got my device ID, and you've got a whole bunch of targeting algorithm coefficients, and that's what you have. And like, okay, well, against, you know, and it's true that there are like a lot of creepy companies that do sell user information, and I don't think those companies should exist. I have a big problem with those companies. I don't think the device identifier is a good idea, right? I think that should have, you know, been done away with. I think there's ways to sort of do probabilistic sort of identity that don't involve a discrete number that is attached to my, you know, a specific piece of hardware that I own. But putting all that aside, like, what is this data used for? It's used to build coefficients that sort of like are unintelligible, right? And so if you say, well, those coefficients no longer exist, is my privacy more protected as a result of that, right? Like, because Facebook doesn't have these coefficients anymore. You know, my privacy has been more protected. Well, I don't necessarily think it does. And then if you think about like, well, okay, well, what are the consequences of that? Ads become less targeted that I see. Well, that kind of that's a negative consequence, right? So like, I think like anytime you talk about this stuff, first of all, I think you need to eliminate this sort of idea of like the munificence of these companies, or just the pure benevolence of like wanting to look out for me, because it just doesn't exist, right? Anytime privacy is thrown around, it's a cover for some sort of like commercial initiative, right? And maybe it is, and this is, I think, is a fair argument to make. Apple wants to be seen as like the privacy protective company because that sells more iPhones. Okay, but then let's call it what it is. It's wanting to sell more iPhones relative to Android devices. Okay, fine. Then maybe that's the reason. I think the reason actually is to promote its importance in the sort of mobile ecosystem around distribution and gatekeeping. And I think there's also an element of trying to to grow its ad network. But putting those things aside, like anytime you hear, just privacy is not something that any company, unless that's the commercial purpose of the company, it's what they're selling, right? Is privacy, like some sort of like I don't know,
like one trust or like
sure.
So, okay, I get what you're saying. It's a means to an end.
It's still in service of a commercial interest, right? So I just kind of like wince when people say, oh well, he's such a cares about my privacy, just apropos of nothing. Well, that can't possibly be the case.
Yeah. So who should care about our privacy then? Let's take a consumer standpoint. Is it the regulators who should care about our privacy? And do you think the regulator is equipped to care about our privacy?
Well, it is, who I think that if there's to the extent there's an entity that should, be aggressive and deliberative in terms of doing that, it is regulators. But no, they're not equipped at all. They're way behind.
Yeah, and so that's an issue, right? Because then we're left between like a rock and a hard place in a way, right? With no way to translate the commercial benefits that are being attached to privacy into actual consumer protection, and so it. I think a big part of the problem is education around. I mean, the way you explain privacy is very clear, but like you should tell that to 7 billion people, right? I don't think you're quite there yet with mobile dev memo audience, although it's growing it's growing fast, right?
Yeah.
But that how can we explain privacy? Because in the end, it's a question of value exchange, right? Like as you're saying, like we need personalized messaging because it's more valuable for brands and they can pay for the service that you want to access for free, right? Yeah. That value exchange has been implicit for like 50 years or however long advertising's been in existence. Should we have a more kind of explicit direct dialogue with consumers around those notions of using data? Do you think it's a message we can have, or?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that was the point that I made in an article. Let me look it up. An article I wrote on Mobile Dev Memo called, quote, "Allow this app to personalize advertising to you." And my idea there was that, the ATT, app tracking transparency, opt-in prompt, it's a template that developers can't really edit to any meaningful extent. You get like one little line of text, but the headline text is just like this intimidating, language around how the app is going to track you across.
Allow the app to track you.
Yeah, across third-party apps and websites. Like, well, of course I'm going to say no to that. Why what's in it for me? Right. Now, if you just reframe that as like, hey, even if you used the same text, you just added onto it and you said, for the purposes of personalizing advertising to you. Yeah. I'm sure opt-in rates would be higher than they are. It's just like the way that this was presented to the user is that, look, it's all upside if you opt out. And what these companies are doing is invasive and pernicious. Yeah. Well, then, of course, no reasonable person is going to opt in. I mean, I think if you actually framed it as, look, there's a trade-off here. Your data is going to be collected, right? It's going to be aggregated and it's going to be used to build a profile of you that is then used to target ads to you. And as a result of those targeted ads, you're going to see stuff. You're going to see, as a result of that targeting, you're going to see ads that are more relevant to you. Like, well, then, people would probably take pause and say, yeah, okay, I buy that. And I think, abstracting one layer up, it's just like that conversation never gets had. And if you do any, if you look into any sort of like privacy research, and especially digital advertising privacy research, there's always a nod to the privacy utility trade-off. It's like the more private you get, no data is shared or collected, well, then the less utility there is for the user. And that applies to advertising. It applies to just the functionality of any sort of digital product. And, I think just making that clear to the user just provides for like a more informed choice, first of all, but also just like a better debate about what needs to be protected. Because again, like if you told a user, look, there's some coefficients that are only useful in Facebook's advertising targeting model, and they're attached to a device ID, and all that stuff is like swirling around in the ether. Would most people care? Like probably not, right? You know, I think about, you know, a lot of this debate is driven by this kind of like ideological movement. It's called the New Brandeis movement. And, you know, Lena Khan is like the standard bearer for that. And, you know, you go back and you read what Louis Brandeis talked about when he, you know, he was kind of the first person, you know, Supreme Court justice, who sort of talked about privacy as like a right and something that needed to be protected. What he was talking about was like the sort of, you know, the state of someone's reputation. And, you know, I wrote an article about this a couple months ago. But like the sort of the substance of his argument was like, and it was catalyzed by the sort of the kind of rise of the tabloid press, right? And so there's this moment when the, you know, tabloids were writing articles about people and they were taking pictures of them in compromising situations. And he said, look, you know, people have the right, you know, in the sort of just course of their daily lives to not have their reputation maligned, right? You know, and you know, and so you can't just invade their privacy in that way. And privacy was basically just used as a kind of catch-all term for like you know, just the state of someone's reputation and their ability to control it, right? Their ability to control it through their own actions and not the actions of somebody else that they didn't really you know, approve of. And so, well, that doesn't happen when your device ID gets coupled with a bunch of targeting parameters and gets used by Facebook, and your device ID plus like some, you know, event you know, shorthand gets passed back to Facebook from an app or from a website, right? Like that's not happening. And you know, and it, first of all, because it's shared between parties that have like, you know, a genuine interest in that not happening, because it's proprietary data to them and they want it used for themselves. And then when it gets aggregated up, it's just unintelligible anyway, right? So you know, I think if you want to, you know, take this stance that, you know, in the Brandeisian way that, you know, privacy protection is a human right, well, then you kind of have to define privacy in a sort of more modern context, right? And then also as it relates to like the data that digital platforms do collect. And if you think it makes sense to say then, well, no, that is a potential threat to my reputation, I don't want that shared, I have to sort of certify the fact that it gets shared between some app or some website and Facebook. I think that's fine too. People should have the right to say, yes, I agree, but they should also have the right to make an informed choice. And, you know, that when you present them with that choice, it shouldn't be, you know, you shouldn't be trying to put your thumb on the scale, right? And to try to manipulate their opt-in or their opt-out with scary language or intimidating language,
which is clearly what's happening with ATT and the way they frame the consent box. I agree with you. Let me play the, you know, devil's advocate here. Totally agree with you. Like, it's not about, you know, people's reputation anymore. We're not in the tabloid, whatever that was, like, you know, early 20th century or whatever. It's not about that. But do you think there is a danger to kind of, you know, super granular data usage, in the sense that it creates a kind of a bubble, a filter to what you have access to and what you see, and how that can kind of lead to polarization, that leads to like you know, kind of yeah, different content, different messaging being passed to different people because of what they know. It's less of an advertising issue, right? But it's also related to kind of granular data usage, which is what privacy advocates are kind of advocating against. Do you think it's kind of baked into the same? And I'm referring to, like, you know, obviously like election manipulation in various countries and stuff like that, and the use of Facebook to kind of weaponize data usage for election manipulation purposes. Is there a risk that we're kind of bundling all of that together, or do you think it's kind of separate? It's not the same topic.
I mean, I do think those need to be separated, because they are, you know, and I don't want to, like, you know, I'm not a sociologist, so I don't want to jump into like, you know, filter bubbles or you know, radicalization. I mean, you know, that's a, you know, you're talking about like basically the substance of that movie, The Social Network, right? Or sorry, the Social Dilemma. And
Yeah, yeah.
Did you see that on
I'm talking
Netflix?
about. I'm talking. I mean, you can if you take a granular, like let's take a digital analogy, right? Like you've seen that I'm interested in golf, and so all I'm seeing from now on is kind of golf courses and golf equipments and all those things, right? And so you're kind of my exposure to content, to advertising content, will be kind of driven by what Facebook, Apple, Google, etc. know about me. And so you're going to limit my understanding of the world. You're going to limit my exposure to things based on what you know, right? Let's take a less sensitive topic than radicalization or political manipulation. But like, are there risks there? Is there a risk that people are going to be? I mean, we know that people are scared by retargeting, right? And so, is there a risk of a disconnect here because of overusing kind of granular personal data? And is that a risk to the sustainability of the advertising model, do you think?
I mean, could be. I mean, so yeah, you're talking about like hyper engagement optimization using that feedback loop, right?
Yeah.
Which is
Yeah.
that mechanic could power an online a digital ads platform, or it could just power the entire sort of like content platform, like the news feed, right?
Exactly.
They're both powered by the kind of fundamentally
same
similar
algorithm. Exactly. Yeah.
Mechanisms, right? I mean, is there a problem with that? Well, I don't think so. I mean, I think people prefer that, right? Like, I mean, if I go to my Facebook feed, it's got exactly what I want in there, right? I click on pug photos, and I have a pug. I love pugs, and I see a pug photo every time I on Facebook, and be happy. Sometimes I go there because I need that jolt of cuteness, because I've been dealing with nonsense all day or whatever. So that's operating as right. I think like I don't want to get into like a political but like I just feel like some of this stuff is overstated a little bit, because like first of all, these are designed that way, and second of all, like everything is designed that way. Like it's just that the online nature of it. I mean, like online in a sort of algorithmic just sort of like feedback loop context, like having the ability to do that with a digital product is just so much more acute than with like a book, right? And publishers do the same thing. They try to book publishers, they try to optimize what they're publishing based on engagement with some previous cohort of products. Of course, it's just that if you have a digital product, you can do that in real time, at like sort of like internet scale, with like sort of millisecond latency, right? And push people into like content tunnels. But I don't know that that's not always been the case. I mean, you've always had you've always had outlets that had a specific that had a specific kind of viewpoint on the world that people gravitated to because of confirmation bias. Right. So I don't think that you're really fundamentally changing the engagement optimization model. You're just making it so much more effective that it happens kind of in real time. But also I give human beings a lot of credit, right? I think generally people are capable of understanding when they're being manipulated, and being able to kind of to an extent, I guess, but have an ability to recognize misinfo and things that are not true for or that are selectively portrayed for the purposes of animating them or causing some reaction. But I think some people like engaging with that stuff because it just sort of reinforces the worldview, right? So I mean, but to the extent that this applies to advertising, I don't think and I've never been of the opinion that you could like just trick someone into buying something they don't really want. I mean, assuming that you're not just like falsely
of course,
something as being different than it is
within the limits of the law.
Right, within the limits of the law. And I always my sort of go to anytime I'm struggling with like a problem or just sort of like a philosophical issue in advertising. I mean, I keep a copy of it right next to me on my desk. I go back to Ogilvy on advertising, and that to me is just like the canonical sort of text on how to build a successful ad. And he says you can't trick people into buying something, or maybe you can trick people into buying something once, right? But you can't build a business on that. basis. So like putting aside any of the sort of like, just radicalization, manipulation, that kind of stuff, and just focusing purely on advertising, I don't think that those mechanics are bad. I think they're super effective, right? And people want to see relevant ads. They don't want to see the relevant ads. No one wants to go back to 20 years ago and like the sort of nascent age of internet advertising was just blanket, hey, or it was just totally contextual based on the website you were on, right? People want to see personalized ads. People like them. People like engaging with them. People like having, products that they might not have known about, sort of surface to them.
Yeah. Like you like the recommendation from Netflix and Amazon because, it's relevant to you.
Right. And how's it any different than an advertisement? It is an advertisement. It's
just
not paid for, right?
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's. I mean, that was super philosophical. So let's go back to kind of more kind of concrete, real life things. I'd like to understand. I mean, you have a really kind of clear and deep understanding of kind of Apple's changes around app tracking transparency. It's obviously a massive change, and it's kind of a partial change, but I think it's representative of a much broader kind of trajectory that we've seen with like browsers as well around like the limitations of the default identification capabilities provided by the devices. I'm interested in obviously kind of ID5 kind of fights back against that and try to kind of help kind of brands and publishers and engage with each other on a user level basis. But I'd like to understand your point of view on the impact that it's had. You were talking about opt-in rates earlier. What have you seen over the past kind of, what was that, been like 3-4 months? What has changed in the world post-ATT? And what can you tell us of kind of those impressions, those kind of learning that you've had over that period of time?
Right. So it's kind of been relevant, or, the effect has been, perceivable since like early June. So it's been like 2 months because
Okay.
Apple rolled out 14.5, but it only ever hit like a 20% something adoption rate. And then they rolled out 14.6 and the adoption curve was kind of similar. And then they do like when they're ready to sort of like get people to mass adopt an update, they do like a badge notification on the settings app. And so they did that right before WWDC. And so it sort of upticked, and the adoption curve inflected, and now it's at something like 80-ish%, maybe even more. So yeah, the vast majority of people have installed 14.6. 14.6 makes opt-in mechanic mandatory, and you're just seeing roughly similar. I mean, there's a lot of numbers floating around. I first of all, I think the opt-in rate is somewhere around where people thought it would be, between maybe 20-30%, kind of on average. Now, I don't think, and I wrote an article about this a couple months ago called, ATT opt-in rates are irrelevant. The average opt-in rate is kind of it's kind of a red herring. The average rate at which people opt in has no sort of connection to the availability of an IDFA in any given like bid request, right? So the fact that even if my app has a 30% opt-in rate, that doesn't mean like 30% of the time when I go to fill an impression, there's not, that there I can match that, right, with some advertiser. It just means that 30% of people have their IDFA available to me, but anybody that wants to buy that impression also has to have that specific IDFA available to make a match, right? And so that
it's 30% of 30% of 30%. Like it's that Venn diagram, right? It's the intersection of all those 30% that makes sense at the end.
Exactly. So, so the sort of like the match rate or like the availability rate is much lower. And then it's definitely much lower. And then, and my point in that article is that, well, it's ultimately it's constrained by Facebook's, right? For mobile advertisers, it's constrained. Your specific opt-in rate doesn't matter, because ultimately it's going to be what Facebook's is, because that's how people are going to buy your inventory, or that's where you're going to be advertising, right? Like that's where you're going to be advertising, is on Facebook. And so your average, your opt-in rate is interesting for that sort of like, if you think about that waterfall, it's sort of like, especially for app advertisers, it's like kind of Facebook, Google, some of the other SANs, and then after that, that's when your opt-in rate really matters, right? Because if you're going to be buying on Facebook, then everything's constrained by Facebook's opt-in rate, and they're the biggest sort of publisher, right? So, Yeah, we're seeing optimization around. I mean, it's had a tremendous impact. It's had a pretty severe impact. Just generally, some sort of categories are impacted more than others. I think, and then I think one misconception about the whole thing was like it only impacted app advertisers, but the reality is it impacts all mobile advertisers. It impacts web campaigns just the same. And you've seen a pretty severe impact there, especially with like D2C and e-com brands and stuff. Their ability to sort of like, because again, it's like that feedback loop is really where the sort of value of the IDFA and came into play, is being able to show an ad to a user, have them go to some external property, and then every sort of conversion that happens on that third party going back to Facebook, so that Facebook could take that new data, update its priors, bake that into its targeting model, and for the benefit of everybody, right? Because knowing that user likes pants and they buy pants, or that user likes this type of app and they download that app and make some purchases, that helps all other advertisers for those types of products, and it helps you as the advertiser that drove that conversion. It helps your campaign, because then Facebook says, okay, well, that's a good user. Let me find users that look like them and funnel them into your ads, or expose your ads to them. And so that's the real value prop of the IDFA, and that gets broken, and it's just going to impact all advertisers. But more acutely so the advertisers that are really driving those kind of like immediate conversions, or need those need that kind of targeting specificity just to have viable unit economics, right? And so one of the things about e-com is that the kind of the kind of I don't know, the mainstream or the go-to sort of attribution model was like 28-day click. Right. Well, you lose, in this new sort of system, you only get 1-day click with the replacement for just this event stream based on the IDFA, or based on, just the user ID and the user identity, the user's identity. And so, you're losing the other 27 days, right, of timeline over which they can make a purchase. And so it's just like, you get this very limited amount of time to observe anything. You get a much more limited catalog of things to observe for e-com. And so it's had a really pretty serious impact on the ability to do measurement.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you're focusing on measurement, because I think, especially on the web, right, a lot of discussion around the loss of cookies, which is kind of a similar dynamic, has been around the ability to use data for targeting. But in reality, the biggest impact it's having is on measurement, right? Like that's the feedback loop. That's what driving the investment in the first place anyway. So I think the impact of identification, or loss of identification, on measurement is much greater, because that's the key kind of driver of investment for brands.
Yeah, well, so I would just kind of like just to kind of riff on that for a second and hover there. So the measurement piece is, so the targeting is great. Like, so if I know a user's IDFA, I can target them, right? And that's no longer possible because of this change. But if I don't, right, that measurement and passing that measurement back to the platform of my choice, or just that signal that this conversion happened, that allows them to alter their targeting, right? So it's like it's like the direct targeting is like just knowing that identity, and that's gone with it's gone with the deprecation of cookies. It's gone with the IDFA. I mean, that just goes away. But then, that sort of feedback loop that exists between measurement and targeting gets disrupted, because if I can't do the measurement, then I can't pass those conversions back, and they can't update, the ad platform can't update their targeting to know, like, hey, well, we just drove a conversion, so our targeting is good. Let's sort of like let's sort of like reify our understanding of that by updating our priors, or and then also like kind of marking that user as like the purchaser of pants or whatever, that allows us to, like, not on an individuated basis, but like on the basis of being a purchaser of pants, let's target more pants ads to them in the future. Like that gets broken too. So it's like there's kind of like a the sort of the second order effect of that is still kind of it's still targeting, right? It's not direct targeting of like, let me target that individual.
Yeah, but that's it. Like the breaking the feedback loop impacts targeting, whatever targeting. It could be contextual targeting, right? It could be choosing to run ads on an app that's contextually relevant, even if you don't know the IDFA of the user, right? That's still useful for that. But if you don't know the IDFA, you don't know who converts, and so you don't know what type of behavior you have to target for.
Yeah.
what advice? I mean, I'm sure you're talking to plenty of people on those topics. What advice do you give to advertisers and agencies on those changes? Like, what do you think they can do? What are best practices that you've seen in the market for people to kind of adjust, adapt, change the way they operate to kind of either mitigate or kind of replace those approaches?
Yeah, I mean, my sort of suggestion here would be to just kind of try to skate to where the puck is heading. I see a lot of people trying to like, minimally invest in changes with just kind of like duct tape solutions that try to preserve the way that their systems work, right? So that they don't want to burn the whole system down and rebuild it from scratch, but you kind of have to. I mean, like, this isn't going to reverse course at any point in time, or it's not going to end. It's not like, well, ATT was it, or up third party. We're moving in a direction where you won't be able to do user level targeting and measurement, right? And I don't, just kind of going back to the discussion we had before, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think it's probably a good thing, actually. I think it's a good thing if users are more sort of trustworthy and generally like feel like their personal data is being safeguarded. Even though I don't really think it wasn't in like the sort of Facebook, paradigm, but putting that aside. So that's what you need to just sort of acknowledge. Like, so like, these duct tape solutions, or like these sort of like partial solutions or incremental changes, they're not going to be viable for very long, if they're even viable now. Right. So like, if you're going to build a probabilistic model, why do it just to try to tell you that this specific user came from this specific ad click? First of all, it's probably going to be wrong. And second of all, you're probably not going to be able to do that for very long anyway. Like, I think the way I'd rather approach that is to like, well, let's start thinking of what like the actual long-term solution is versus like some short-term hack that might work for a little while, but there's going to be other shoes to drop, right? Like, we're not we're looking at like an octopus and it's lost one shoe. There's 7 more or whatever, maybe you get my point. Like, there's a lot of shoes that will drop in the future. And so like, if you're going to have to like just constantly be sort of like implementing these short-term hacks that you think are going to break in 6 months, why not just, rip the Band-Aid off and sort of like build something that's a little bit more robust and future-proof. And so that's kind of like, that's been my recommendation, to my clients. It's like, you really need to, for mobile apps, you really need to lean into this SKAd network framework that Apple, made available to kind of replace this sort of event stream. And so that just means like, well, all of that work that, instead of trying to, and first of all, people were just pretending on mobile that a lot of this measurement was deterministic. It wasn't, right? There was a lot of fuzziness anyway, but, just leaning into this idea that I'm going to get campaign level anonymous data. I really need to go through the analytical exercise of understanding what these events are worth versus just summing up the conversion events that a single user makes, right? And then attributing that to a specific campaign, right? Like, I need to do a lot more to understand, the potential path that a user could take in my product and what any given interaction that they have with my product means in terms of their long-term value. And that's hard work. And that's a different type of work. It's a different type of work. It's not just instrumenting events and counting. It's doing real predictive, probabilistic, projections and estimations. And that requires different people. It requires different tools. It's a whole new sort of a whole new paradigm. But that's what I think people should be investing into, and not, just trying to reshape the data so that it fits the existing kind of data architecture with estimates and with predictions.
Yeah, the future doesn't fit in the containers of the past. I think that's
right.
That's a famous word. I'm not going to take credit for it. So yeah, I think invest in probabilistic approaches, invest in kind of clarifying value exchanges with your consumers, making sure they understand like what that value exchange is. Invest in privacy preserving approaches. I think that those are all kind of super valuable advice. Eric, it's been a really interesting discussion. Thanks a lot for your time. I'm sure we could have gone forever, but we're limited by time. So really appreciate you joining us, and to all of you listeners and watchers who've followed us on Spotify and YouTube. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah, cheers. Thank you for having me.
Bye.